She never would have known if he'd been better at covering his tracks. But he'd never been careful, not really. Careless with money, with promises, with the soft, unspoken trust that makes a life between two people feel steady. He'd always brushed off her questions about the bills, about the sudden gaps in their savings account. "I've got it handled, don't worry," he'd say, kissing her forehead like she was a child who didn't need to know how the lights stayed on. It was a Thursday afternoon when she found out. She'd come home early from work, the grocery bag still looped around her wrist, when she saw the envelope, thick, official-looking, carelessly left on the kitchen counter next to an empty mug and a pile of junk mail. She could have ignored it, but something about the bold letters, the bank's name, her father's initials on the statement, made her stomach tighten. She set the bag down, the apples rolling out and bumping against the floor. She didn't pick them up. She just stood there under the humming kitchen light, tearing the envelope open with fingers that went cold the moment she read the first line. Her father's trust, the one thing she had left after he died, the nest egg he'd spent his life building brick by brick so she'd never feel trapped or beholden, gone. Transferred. Not to her account, not to pay down their own mortgage, not into a college fund for the children he always promised they'd have someday. Gone to his brother. A lump sum so large she felt dizzy trying to picture it, a loan signed off without her signature, her knowledge, her consent. Her husband's scrawled initials were on the release form. So were his brothers. The brother older, louder, with that wild edge that made him the family's charming disaster. The one who'd always joked about borrowing a little here and there when his gambling luck turned sour. She'd heard stories about the debts. The late-night calls, the unpaid tabs, the whispered arguments that always ended with someone bailing him out. She'd never thought she'd be the one they'd drain dry next. She pressed her palm flat on the countertop, willing her breath to steady. A breeze drifted through the cracked kitchen window, rattling the pile of receipts and takeaway menus pinned under the fruit bowl. She caught sight of the apples again, one of them bruised where it had rolled into the leg of a chair. She felt a rush of anger, bright and sharp, not at the fruit, not at the envelope, but at the way he'd smiled at her just that morning, kissed her cheek, told her not to work too hard while he was handing her future to his brother like a bag of spare change. She found him in the garage later that evening, elbows deep in his old car, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. He looked up and grinned that grin she'd once found so charming. "Hey, you're home early. I was gonna make dinner in a bit." She didn't let him finish. She held up the envelope. "When were you planning on telling me?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm. She could see the flicker in his eyes, the instant shift from casual to cornered. "Babe, listen." She dropped the envelope onto the workbench between them. No. You listen. My father worked every day of his life for that money. He skipped meals to put it aside for me. And you gave it to your brother? He tried to laugh it off, but she could see the panic coiled behind his grin. "It's not like that. It's family. He needed help. You know we'd do the same for you." She almost laughed at that, the absurdity of it. They would never do the same for her. They would never sacrifice a dime for her security. But they'd take every last dollar of hers and call it love. She walked out before he could finish his excuses, the garage door slamming behind her. She didn't know what her next move was yet, but she knew one thing for certain: if they thought she'd stand by while they spent her father's sweat and blood on poker debts and cheap promises, they didn't know her at all. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on her side of the bed, back turned to him, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling she'd never noticed until now. She could hear him breathing, that deep, oblivious sleep that always came so easily to him, even when he'd turned their whole life upside down. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's hands, rough, work-calloused, passing her the first savings bond when she turned 18. "Keep this safe, Beatty. It's not much now, but it's your future. Your freedom." And just like that, it was gone. Not stolen by a stranger, but given away like a favor, handed off to a brother who never knew the meaning of enough. By the time the sky turned pale gray, she knew exactly what she'd do first. She waited until he was in the shower, humming through the sound of the water like nothing had changed, then she walked into the garage. His phone was there, plugged in beside his workbench. She scrolled through the last calls. Of course, his brother's name was at the top, twice, same night he'd stayed late at the bar watching the game. She slipped the phone into her pocket and called the number from her own cell. The brother picked up on the second ring. She could hear the background noise, TV too loud, laughter that sounded forced, like he knew he was living on borrowed time. "Hey. Little sis. What's up? Didn't expect to hear from you." The smirk was so clear in his voice she felt her teeth clench. "Save it. I know everything. The loan, the papers you signed behind my back. That was my inheritance." He made a dismissive sound, like he was batting a fly away. "Come on, don't be so dramatic. It's just money. You'll get it back. We're family, right?" She pictured his grin, the same grin he'd flashed at their wedding, the one that made her mother whisper, "Careful, that one's got a hungry look." She should have listened. "It's not just money," she said, her voice as cold as the tile under her bare feet. "It was mine. It was never yours to spend." He gave a lazy chuckle. "Look, I needed a bridge loan. It's all tied up in the house now. You know how it is, you gotta invest to get ahead. Your guy didn't explain that to you?" Your guy. Like she was just a pretty puppet while her husband pulled the strings. Rage settled in her belly like a stone. Asterisk, you think you can buy me off with empty promises? I want it back. All of it. He laughed outright now, ugly and mean. "Oh, sweetheart. You think you're gonna threaten me? What are you gonna do, sue your own family? Talk to my lawyer. I'll pay you back when I can." And with that, he hung up. When she looked up, her husband was standing in the doorway. Wet hair plastered to his forehead, towel wrapped around his waist, mouth half open like he'd walked in on something he couldn't quite process. "What did you do?" she asked him quietly. He ran a hand through his hair. "I did what needed to be done. He needed help. He's my brother. He'd do the same for me." She cut him off with a short, sharp laugh. "No, he wouldn't. And neither would you, not for me." He flinched. "You're overreacting. It's just a loan. We'll get it back. You've still got your job. We're not broke." She stepped forward, her voice low but steady. Asterisk, you didn't just take money. You took my father's trust. You gave away my security, my safety. You treated my future like a blank check for your brother's mistakes." He tried to reach for her arm, but she stepped back. "Don't touch me." And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw it, the flicker of fear. Not fear of her, but fear that he'd miscalculated. That the woman he'd always trusted to nod along and forgive might not forgive him this time. "You want to know what's next," she said, stepping around him toward the door. Asterisk, watch me. I'm done asking nicely." She didn't slam the door when she left. She closed it with the same careful calm her father had always shown her. And she didn't look back. She spent the next few days alone in her car, parked outside the little library her father used to take her to on Sunday mornings. It wasn't much of a library anymore. The roof leaked, the chairs squeaked, and the same old librarian with thick glasses still watched her like she was 12 years old, checking out mystery novels she wasn't old enough to understand. But she didn't come for the books. She came because she could think there. And right now, thinking was the only weapon she had left. She opened her father's old ledger on the passenger seat. He'd kept it like a holy book, scribbled with neat rows of numbers, dates, and small notes in the margins. He'd grown up with nothing, dirt floors, second-hand shoes, days when his mother went hungry so he could eat. She could still see him at the kitchen table, his hair graying at the temples, hands ink-stained as he added up the numbers by hand. One day this will be yours, he'd told her, tapping the page. It won't make you rich. But it'll make you free. Free. That word tasted bitter now. She'd trusted her husband when he said, "We're a team." Trusted him when he brushed aside her worries, told her she didn't need to get involved in the big stuff. He'd made her feel small, soft-voiced, careful, always the one to smooth things over when his brother got drunk at the holiday table, when the family gossiped about her father's small-time money. But sitting there, the sun setting behind the library's broken blinds, she realized she'd learned more from her father than they'd ever guessed. He'd taught her that money didn't make you powerful. Knowing where it went, how it moved, how it hid, that was power. And she'd watched her husband long enough to know exactly where to look. She opened her laptop and typed in the property records site she'd bookmarked months ago when she'd thought about buying a tiny rental on her own. She plugged in her brother-in-law's name. There it was, the house he bragged about, the one with the big garage and the in-ground pool they liked to show off on social media like they were the ones who'd built it brick by brick. She scrolled through the mortgage records, adjustable rate, bloated monthly payments, 2 missed installments already flagged in red. She almost laughed. He hadn't used her inheritance to get ahead. He'd used it to keep his fantasy alive for one more season. He'd buried her father's hard-earned money in a house he was already losing. She wrote down every detail, the bank that owned the note, the balance left, the penalties stacking up like dominoes. Then she called the number on the loan paperwork, not as his sister-in-law, but as a concerned third-party buyer. She spoke politely, like her father had taught her, no threats, no drama, just facts and questions that made her heart beat faster with every answer. When she closed her laptop that night, her hands were cold but her mind felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. She thought of her father at that wobbly kitchen table, eyes half closed from exhaustion but still adding up the numbers again and again until they balanced perfectly. She thought of the promise she'd made at his funeral, standing in the rain, her inheritance letter folded in her purse like a piece of armor. "I'll never let anyone steal this from me." Well, she hadn't kept that promise. But she could now. She leaned back in her seat, the worn fabric cradling her shoulders like an old friend. She let herself imagine the brother-in-law's face when he'd see her name on the mortgage note. Imagine her husband's stammering excuses when he realized the woman he'd thought too soft, too quiet, too trusting was the one pulling the strings this time. She closed the ledger and tucked it into her bag. She would finish what her father started, and she would do it her way. She woke up the next morning with her father's ledger still tucked into her purse. The edges were worn soft by years of his careful fingers, the pages stained with ink and sweat and the faint smell of the house she grew up in. It felt right to keep it close now, like a talisman that said, "You know what to do. And you know how to do it right." She went to work that day like nothing was different. She smiled at her coworkers, took her lunch at her desk, answered emails while her mind ran loops around interest rates and foreclosure notices. By the time she clocked out, she'd made a list on the back of a takeout menu, a list that would terrify her husband if he ever saw it. It wasn't revenge. Not exactly. It was balance. A ledger brought back to zero. After dinner, which she ate alone at her little corner of the kitchen table, while her husband muttered excuses about catching up with his brother, she sat down with her laptop and her father's old calculator. She searched the public records, the tax liens, every bank that held pieces of her brother-in-law's mortgage. The debts were all there, plain as day, stacked like cheap furniture on a crumbling foundation. And once she saw the cracks, she knew exactly where to push. The next day, she called a real estate investor she'd once met at a community fundraiser, an older woman named Rosa, someone her father had trusted when he was still alive. Rosa's business was simple: buy troubled properties, fix them up, flip them, or rent them to people who paid on time. No nonsense, no pity. When Rosa picked up, her voice was warm but direct. "You sure about this, sweetheart? This isn't a clean business. You can't be soft. Family makes it messy." She pressed the phone tight to her ear, her voice steady. "I'm not soft anymore. They met at a diner on the edge of town. Rosa spread the paperwork across the booth table between their coffee mugs, loan details, default notices, the tiny window of time before the bank foreclosed and the house went on the auction block. Rosa taught her how to approach the bank quietly, how to make an offer big enough to get their attention but small enough to sting when the brother realized someone else now owned the floor under his feet. It cost her almost everything. The last of her father's old account, the tiny savings she'd scraped together from her side jobs, the check she'd once thought she'd use to replace the old couch in the living room. She wrote it out anyway, signing her name with a calm that surprised her. "Your dad would be proud," Rosa said when they stood in the parking lot, the wind tugging at their hair. "This is the smart kind of revenge. Silent. Legal. And it sticks." She smiled, tired but lighter than she'd felt in weeks. "It's not revenge," she said. It's taking back what's mine." When the final papers cleared, she sat at her kitchen table in the glow of the lamp, her father's ledger beside her, the official letter in her hand. Her name, bold and final, listed as the note holder on the mortgage for the house her brother-in-law had used as his playground. The same house he bragged about on social media, the one he joked about renovating once I get some cash together, cash that had come from her father's sweat, her father's promises. She looked across the table at her husband, who had come home late again, smelling like cheap beer and stale excuses. She didn't bother telling him what she'd done. He'd find out soon enough. She poured herself a cup of tea and felt the silence settle around her like armor. She knew they'd call her petty. Heartless. She knew they'd try to spin it into family gossip. Can you believe she did that to her own people? But they weren't her people anymore. Her people were the ones who kept their promises, counted every dollar twice, and left no one behind. And now, she was her people. She didn't knock. She didn't want to give them the luxury of pretending they were surprised by what they knew deep down was coming. She pulled into the long driveway, the one her brother-in-law always bragged about, the one lined with potted plants and a shiny metal gate that squeaked every time it opened. She wondered if he'd bothered to pay the gardener this month, or if that was overdue, too. When she stepped out of the car, the sky was heavy with spring rain. The house loomed big and bland, a poor imitation of something grander, pillars by the door, half-finished patio furniture that looked expensive but was already peeling. It made her think of the cheap shine her brother-in-law wore like a crown. She pressed the doorbell and heard the chime echo inside. It took a moment, but then the door swung open. There he was, leaning against the frame like this was some casual Sunday visit. Her husband was behind him, blinking in confusion, like he hadn't believed she'd actually show up. "Well, if it isn't the bank herself," her brother-in-law laughed, motioning for her to come inside. "Come to check on your investment? Relax, sis. We're working on it." She ignored the smug tilt of his head and stepped inside. The living room looked exactly like she'd pictured, spotless for show, but hollow underneath. She noticed unopened bills stacked on the sideboard, the edges curling. He'd probably hidden the worst of them for this little performance. Her husband started to say something, an apology, maybe, or another tired defense of we're family. She held up her hand. He fell silent. For once, he knew better. She pulled the crisp envelope from her bag and placed it on the glass coffee table between them. The brother-in-law raised his eyebrows, amusement flickering across his face. "What's this? An early Christmas present?" She sat on the edge of the sofa, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It's notice of default," she said calmly. You're 3 payments behind. The mortgage you used my inheritance to secure is now owned by me. You have 2 options, pay the full amount with penalties, or vacate. 30 days. The brother-in-law let out a short bark of a laugh, glancing at her husband for backup. But her husband's eyes were wide, his shoulders slumped as the reality sank in. "You can't be serious," the brother-in-law spat. You'd throw us out? You'd ruin your own family?" She didn't blink. Asterisk, you ruined it when you forged my name onto a loan I never agreed to. You ruined it when you treated my father's money like pocket change for your bad bets. Her husband stepped forward, hands up like a mediator at a street fight. Let's talk about this. We can come up with something. A new payment plan? She turned her gaze on him and the words died in his throat. Asterisk, you made a plan without me. I made mine. This is it. The brother-in-law's face flushed red. You think you can get away with this? We'll fight it. You can't just walk in here and... She leaned forward, her voice ablaze. Asterisk, I didn't walk in here. I bought my way in. I did what my father taught me. Count the cost, then pay it. And now you will too. The silence that filled the room was heavy. She let them sit in it, the brother-in-law's breath ragged with disbelief, her husband's eyes darting between them like a trapped animal. She stood, smoothing the front of her coat. You have 30 days, she said again, each word landing like a hammer. Asterisk, if you're not out, I'll send someone to pack up what's left. She didn't wait for them to answer. She stepped out into the drizzle, the cold air sharp on her cheeks. She half expected her husband to follow her, to try to grab her arm and whisper empty promises. But the door stayed shut behind her. Maybe he finally understood that his half-truths and crooked smiles wouldn't work anymore. She opened her car door, the eviction notice tucked back into her bag. The rain started to fall harder, drumming on the roof like a blessing she'd earned. She didn't know where she'd go from here, what piece of her father's legacy she'd rebuild next. But she knew this much, the only thing they'd ever really underestimated was her. The final notice was delivered by registered mail. She didn't go back to that house again, she didn't need to. She didn't need to see her brother-in-law's smug grin dissolve into something bitter and sour when he packed up the big screen TV he'd bragged about, or the patio furniture he'd bought on her father's dime. She didn't need to watch her husband stand there, arms crossed, trying to look like he still had some control left in this mess. She knew what that scene would look like, and she didn't care to see it. Instead, she spent that morning at the little cafe on the corner, the one she used to pass on her way to work when she and her father still lived in their cramped apartment, saving every penny. She sat by the window with her coffee and the final copy of the transfer papers, her name there in neat bold letters, legal owner, note holder, final say. When she first started all this, she thought it would feel like revenge. Maybe a part of it was. But now, as she traced her finger over her signature, she realized what it really was, an exhale she'd been holding in for years. She moved out 2 days after the locks were changed. Her husband stood in the doorway of the apartment they'd once called home, watching her pack the last box of her things, a few books, her father's old ledger, the tiny framed photo she'd kept on the nightstand of him standing beside her in her cap and gown. I never wanted this, he said, voice hoarse, eyes glassy like he expected her to say it was all a misunderstanding. She zipped up her coat and turned to face him. No. You wanted me quiet. He tried to reach for her, but she stepped back. There was nothing left to say. There was no version of him she'd ever recognize again. She carried the box down the stairs herself. It wasn't heavy, not like the years she'd spent believing she owed them everything she was. She slipped the key under the mat when she left. He could have the empty apartment. He could have the echo of her footsteps fading down the hall. She stayed in a small rented place after that, half the size, twice as clean. No one raised their voice there. No one opened her mail without asking or moved her money without her permission. She bought a small safe for her father's ledger and the last scraps of what he'd left her. Some nights she'd sit at her new kitchen table, running her fingers over the columns of old figures and tiny notes in the margins, the ones that said "for her future" in her father's neat block letters. She thought of the brother-in-law in his cheap motel room somewhere, trying to spin stories about how unfair she'd been, how heartless. She thought of her husband sleeping in his mother's basement again, still pretending he'd done what was best for the family. She wondered if they'd ever really believed that. One evening, after a long day of work, she made herself a simple dinner and ate it at the table in silence. Not the cold, heavy silence of their old house, but the good kind. The kind that tasted like a clean slate, like the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the cheap clock on the wall. Before bed, she flipped open the ledger again and added one last note in the final page, paid in full. Dignity intact. She underlined it twice, just like her father used to when he wanted her to remember something important. In the morning, she'd wake up early and start again. Maybe she'd save up for a new couch, maybe she'd plant something in the tiny balcony box, roots she'd tend all on her own. For the first time in years, the future felt like it was hers to hold. They'd taken her inheritance and turned it into a gamble. But she'd turned it back into a promise. And this time, she'd keep it.